Welcome, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce today John Early. John Early is a mathematical economist. He is the president of the consultancy Vital Few LLC, and he is also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Today, he is here to talk about his most recent book titled The Myth of American Inequality. Welcome, John.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Feel free to
Shall we
share your
go ahead and begin?
Yes. You can share your slides.
Let me, oopsie, hang on. I think I missed the button. There we go.
Mm-hmm. You can do full screen.
It's coming. There we go.
Perfect.
Okay. If that works for you guys, I'm ready to roll here. So I had two great co-authors in this endeavor, Phil Graham and Bob Eklund. And so I get the privilege of discussing it with you all. Our folk hero for our exercise was...
what?
I'm sorry to hear...
Sorry about that. Please
okay.
go ahead.
Was Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain, who is reputed to have said, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know that ain't so." Because that was sort of the theme of what we were trying to deal with, is there's an awful lot of talking about income inequality, and some of it just ain't so. And so we were trying to document that as best as we could. And a lot of modern commentators are falling into Mark Twain's pit there. The Economist, one article in the last couple of years, says it is a truth universally acknowledged that inequality in the rich world is high and rising. Now, the author of that was actually using that as a foil, much as I am. But in any case, it is widely believed that that is true, all the way from the left wing of Bernie Sanders calling the inequality obscene and even immoral. Barack Obama claiming that it drives everything he does in office. I take that as a bit of hyperbole. But nevertheless, even across the aisle, Marco Rubio says the debate is focused on the growing income gap between rich and poor. So the question is, A, how big is that gap? And is it indeed rising? This is the data from the Census Bureau, which is kind of the official source for all the claims, or most of the claims made about income inequality anyway. Now, it may be arranged in a variety of different ways, but here we see it as showing the distribution between income quintiles or fifths of households, ranging from down around $10,000 for the bottom quintile to over 200,000 for the top. And this measure is called money income by census. And so we're going to take a look at what's in there, what's missing, what adjustments does someone need to make to it to get an accurate picture. And this data from census shows the difference between the top and the bottom quintiles of a factor of 16.7. And it's that relationship, which is expressed in a lot of different ways, but fundamentally that relationship that leads people to claim that income inequality is excessive. Now, that income is composed of two pieces: earned income from work and savings and investment, and transfer payments from the government. In the bottom quintile, that's well over 75% of income, and it's almost nothing in the top quintiles, principally only Social Security is the only thing that's up there as a transfer payment. So let's begin by taking a look at the earned income. The blue here is what the census showed us, but they're missing some pieces. At the high end, they don't count capital gains as income. We've added that in. Throughout, they do not count employer-paid benefits, the big one, of course, being health insurance. And at the low end, there is assorted misreporting, which they know from their own audits, and audits both done independently as well as in conjunction with a group of economists from University of Chicago. So we've added all those pieces in. And And that, of course, doesn't move us toward the overstatement of inequality. It actually makes it look bigger because they've left out some income pieces. So we're looking to get this right rather than small. And so the difference here, of course, top to bottom is 60.3, but that's before transfers are added to the bottom and taxes are taken out of the top, and that's what we're going to now work our way through. This 60.3 top to bottom, we tried to answer the question, what are the causes of that? And at least we can, from the current population survey and related data sources, we were able to tease out a good piece of that, but some of it still needs to be worked on for the next book, right? But the biggest single piece is a 32% contribution. Nearly a third comes from difference in work effort. Among, in particular, what are called prime work age adults, ages 19 through 65, who are not full-time students and not retired. In the bottom quintile, only 36% of workers constitute only 36% of prime work age adults. And in the top, it's more than 100% because we're looking here at total workers divided by the prime population. And not only do almost all the prime workers work in the top quintile, lots of those who are full-time students or retired are also working. Those who work in the bottom quintile work only about 17 hours a week, more than twice that much by those in the top. So that accounts for nearly a third of the total difference, top to bottom. Educational attainment accounts for about 25% of it, with one of the big pieces in terms of the change in trend over the years has been the growing number of households headed by 2 college graduates. Occupational choice within one's education accounts for another 6%. Bachelor's degrees in library science earn half as much as bachelor's degrees who are working as biological scientists. And then experience with all those other things held constant accounts for another 2% of inequality, because as you stay in the job, you do gain more experience and higher earnings. Other factors related to employment, which we haven't yet been able to tease out the details on, is 18%. And then savings and investment gives us another 17%. So while there's a lot said about all the investment income that goes into income inequality, it could not be more than 17% of the total. Now let's take that earned income, which we've just put together, and we've got all the pieces, and add to that transfer payments. This is what census adds, but that's only about $800 billion a year out of the $2.8 billion that the government actually pays out. And so we're going to add into that the missing transfer payments. Census principally counts Social Security, SSI, and temporary assistance to needy families in its numbers. What they leave out are such things as refundable tax credits. It leaves out food stamps. It leaves out Medicaid and another more than $2 trillion worth of transfer payments that need to be added. And those are shown graphically here. And when we add those in, the difference between top to bottom goes only to 5.7 to 1. So you see the big difference that transfer payment makes. We reduced the original census estimate by 2/3 because they leave out a lot of stuff. But they, of course, also leave out taxes. They don't consider the fact that you can't spend the taxes that you give to the government. And the orange and red here shows what that is, ranging all the way in the bottom quintile from about 7% of income going to taxes. Of course, most of that is not income tax. There's a little bit of payroll tax. But the big pieces are sales tax, property tax. 40% of those in the bottom quintile are homeowners, and various excise and import duties and so on. So as you can see, that makes a big difference. And now we're down to only 4.0 to 1. So we've gone from 16.7 to 4.0 just by counting all the pieces. But this difference top to bottom, as important as that is, one of, I won't call it entirely a surprise, but we were surprised as to how significant it was. is right here in that little spinning purple rectangle. The differences between the bottom, second, and middle quintile are tiny. The bottom 60% of households, after adjustment for transfers and taxes, is essentially flat. Same data in a slightly different format, so that we can kind of focus in on the relationship of those transfers. I mean, the relationship of the different quintiles in a little more compact space. And that second quintile versus the second quintile has only 8% more income, but 2.8 times as many of their prime workers are working, and they work on average 1.8 more hours per week, 1.8 times more hours per week than the bottom quintile does. When you move to the middle quintile, the checkerboard square there, they get 32% more income than the bottom quintile, but more than 3 times as many of their prime age workers are working, and they work more than twice as many hours per week. So that's a huge difference in the work effort with only minor difference in the income. Now, one of the things that's often done in inequality studies is to adjust for household size. And we've done that using 3 different methods, but I report here only the average of the 3, just for the economy of space, because the differences are somewhat different by magnitude, but not a whole lot. And we get the numbers that look like this. And of course, the difference between the top and the bottom is now only 2.7 to 1. So that's gotten a lot less. But what's more compelling is the bottom quintile, adjusted for size, actually receives 5% more income than the second quintile, even though second quintile has 2.8 times more people work of their prime age workers working, and they work almost twice as many hours. And the third quintile, or the middle quintile, has only a 7% margin over the bottom. So those 3 are really flat when you adjust for size. Now, there are a number of other measures one can use, but one of the more frequently used ones is so-called Gini coefficient, not a mythical creature that lives in a bottle, a fellow that invented it. It's a measure of inequality. 0 means zero inequality, or if you would, perfect equality. Every household gets exactly the same income. 1.0 says all income goes to one household. Of course, that's only theoretical. Not likely we're going to actually see one of those. But that's the nature of the structure. And census actually computes the Gini coefficient for its income measure, and it looks like this, rising 22.9% from 1947, and about the same from 1967, just a little bit different. But they don't count 2/3 of the transfer payments, and they don't adjust for taxes. When we do that, we find out that indeed, not only does it not rise, it actually falls ever so slightly by about 3%. So clearly, we're getting a misrepresentation of what goes on because they don't count all the data. Now, a related measure is poverty, poverty incidence, or the rate of poverty. And let's talk a little bit about how that's calculated. This is the income distribution for 2017. Now I've got it by percentile to give a little more refined view of the distribution. And what census does is it takes that data and uses a definition that was applied by the government 50 years ago, that poverty is the ability to satisfy minimum, or inability to satisfy minimum needs. And the poor are those whose income from all sources, together with assets holdings, are inadequate to satisfy minimum needs. And that threshold is moved forward by CPI over the years, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. Now, this is an average across all of the 48 different households, because the different household sizes and composition in terms of senior citizens, adults, children, and so on. And this is the average of them. But that works out to be that in 2017, 12.3% of the population lived in households that lived below the poverty threshold for their particular size and type of household. So that's how the calculation is done. But we know that that red line there, census doesn't count 2/3 of the transfer payments and doesn't take away the taxes. The taxes have only minor effect here, but those missing transfer payments have a lot. And so the blue line gives us, this is now what the income distribution looks like when you get all the transfer payments in there. And the poverty rate then would have been 2.5% using that definition. So quite clearly, we're not only overstating inequality, we're overstating poverty. And let's go back a bit to ancient history, which I remember well. Some of you are not that old, but others of you are coming close. The war on poverty was proposed by Lyndon Johnson in 1965. The funds started to flow a little bit in 1966, and by 1967, they were flowing quickly. But what's interesting is that the 20 years before he made that proposal, poverty had actually fallen by more than half, from up around 35% to just about 16, 17%. And so what was he trying to do? Well, he wanted to accelerate that fall, as well as move away from handouts to having people moving to earning their own income. We will see later that neither of those worked too well. But in any case, that's what he was looking at. And that dash line there is what the trend was. So what happened after the war on poverty? Well, for the first 3 or so years, it continued to fall right along the trend line. And then it stopped. So the war on poverty arrested the fall in poverty rather than accelerating it. The poverty rate has oscillated since then, or up until 2017 anyway, between about 15.5% and 11.1%. There's no improvement. But you can now answer the question, why not? Well, it's because census wasn't counting all those transfer payments. And if we add those in, there we have the poverty rate falling over time to 2.5%. So
Yeah, I have a quick question on that, because at the same time that the poverty rate was falling so much, I mean, some of this is after World War II, when the rest of the world's industrial capacity had been decimated, and so, some of that reduction in the drop in poverty, just because the industrialized world, like West Germany and Japan and so on, started being more competitive as they built up after the war. And could that be another factor?
Well, it's one of the reasons why, surely, but it's not a reason why it stopped rising. I mean, stopped falling. And in fact, it did continue to fall if you count all the transfer payments. That's the point. Yeah, no, that's a perfectly valid point. We actually make that point in the book. That's a good point. Anything else as I'm paused here? Okay. Now, in addition to the fact that the census doesn't count a lot of the income, especially like 90% of the income in the very lowest households, the way it adjusts the poverty thresholds also causes the poverty rate to be overstated. It adjusts it by the consumer price index. The thresholds were set back in the 60s based on the actual consumption levels. And the consumer price index is used to supposedly adjust it for the cost of living. But there are two biases in that index that overstate inflation by 84%. And full disclosure here, I used to run the CPI, so I know why that is so. That's it's partly my fault. But that overstatement comes from two sources. One of them is so-called substitution bias, which is when relative prices change, consumers will adjust what they buy to optimize their utility or their well-being. So the price of beef and chicken both go up, but if beef prices rise more than chicken prices, people consume more chicken, less beef. And the CPI just assumes that they continue to consume the same amount of each, which of course then overstates the correction for pure price change. Fortunately, there is a index that adjusts for that called the Chain Consumer Price Index, or CPIU. It's been available for more than 20 years, but it's not. Nobody uses it except Congress did add it to adjust the the income tax limits, which is interesting because they cause the income tax limits to rise more slowly. Therefore, we can collect more taxes, but don't use it to adjust spending, wherefore we spend more. So it's a perfect storm. You use the one that fits your purpose, perhaps. But in any case, so not using that, as well as before the year 2000, we've used the personal consumption expenditure index, which has some of the same features as the many of the same features as the change CPI, just made on a slightly different expenditure base. The second bias is the new product or new item bias. And that comes from the fact that when a new item arises, the analysts at BLS have to split the observed price of the new thing into two pieces: pure price change and, if you would, the quality or quantity change. And it's not that they don't do that, it's just that it's imperfect and there's not as much as could be done. For example, there's a disease-based price index that BLS and BEA actually put together, which should be used in replacing the current CPI's medical cost index, because it adjusts for the change in quality and relative costs of procedures. And we could go into a whole bunch of details on that. But that already exists. Again, it exists for about 20 years, and it could be used in that place of the piece in the CPI directly. And there's a very large professional literature. There are more than 50 significant professional articles on various adjustments for quality in the consumer price index that could have been incorporated but have not been. Now, over time, the CPI has gotten better. They've made some improvements, like cell phones. They made a major improvement a couple of years ago, but it doesn't change the historical data, and there's still a big 0.5% per year, roughly, bias from that source. So using the chain consumer price index plus using the best literature estimates for the other components, we get a change, pardon me, that is about half the size, or it's 84% less inflation than what the CPI has. And so if you apply that to setting the thresholds for poverty, this is the chart we were just looking at. Well, fixing the thresholds takes yet more out of it and takes it down to about 1.1% in 2017. So that one's a little more involved than the others. The others are just simply, pardon me, adding in the missing pieces. Excuse me. Now, of course, one of the big pieces of at least rhetoric around matter of income inequality has to do with the super rich. And there we have a whole chapter on that one. And in particular, the question of, do they pay their fair share, whatever that might be. But many of you have probably seen this data here by Sayers and Zuckman. It's what went into Piketty's piece as well. And they claim that the tax rate paid by households is basically 25% plus or minus a little bit, except for the people who are really rich, the top 400, where it drops below 25%. This, however, is not consistent with reality. Again, it's one of those things we know that isn't so. And if we put in data that came out of the work we've done, this red line here shows a very different trend to the tax rates. Well, why is that so? Let's take a look at that, if we might. The dollar amounts used for taxes in these calculations are essentially identical, because they all come from basically the same places. So it's not a difference in the tax numbers paid, it's a difference in the income by which the tax numbers are divided. And Sayers and Zuckman do some interesting stuff. First of all, they don't include transfer payments in income. Well, if the very lowest income people didn't have any transfer payments, they couldn't pay any taxes at all, because if you're not counting their transfer payments, they have no income or essentially no income. So well, that then leads to some interesting results that if even under their definition, then people in the lowest few percentile don't have enough money to even cover their taxes by their definition. So what do? They just throw away the bottom 15 percentiles. They just don't use them. So where it says 0 to 10 there, it's really 16 to like 23 or something, okay? So that makes for all the difference. That's the only difference. They're not counting the transfer payments and the income in the first half of that distribution. So that red line, of course, counts all the transfer payments, just like we've been saying. And once you get to the 50th percentile, the two are the same. And up to the 90th, they're pretty much the same as well. Just minor variations owing to the fact that the percentiles are now calculated with the are calculated in the Sayes-Zuckman data using only 85% of the data. Okay, but then what happens at the top end? Because now the difference between the two reverses. Well, it revolves around capital gains. We're including capital gains in our income here, but the other fellows count fictional capital gains. That is to say, the hypothetical estimates of unrealized gains. And of course, they're making guesses. How much did that oil painting increase? How much did the house increase? How much did the value of the closely held family company increase? How did that value increase? Well, you don't know because many of those things don't have market value. So they're making guesses, and B, they're not income anyway because you can't spend it. So that red line then counts all the actual income. Now, both of them show a decline of about the same magnitude for the top 400 cases, the top 99.9969 percentile, if you would. And that particular number is what's used because that's the finest differentiation that IRS publishes. And you see both of them drop, but they're at different levels because the blue line does not include, includes hypothetical numbers that are not real income of attributed unrealized capital gains. But the reason for the drop is that most of the income for those really high cases are from 1 and 2 time capital gains. The average time that a tax-paying unit spends in the top 400 is 2 years. It basically comes from quick 1 time or 2 time capital gains, and in some cases, very large charitable distributions, which then lead the tax rate to be low. But it's not a place where a lot of people stay for a very long period of time. And in any case, it's still above everybody below the 90th percentile. So the big boys and girls can fight over how they want the taxes split up, but the average person who the advocates for they don't pay their fair share want to advocate pay a good deal less income, no matter how you measure it. Another way of looking at the same problem is looking at how the earners compare across country. Top earners compare across countries. This is from the OECD. And it's the top 10% of earners, what their taxes share is as a share of income. So, for example, the US numbers have the top 10% of earners earn 33% of the income, but they pay 45% of the taxes. So that says their taxes have a 34.6% greater share than their share of income. That is the highest of any country the OECD publishes data for. And it falls off, Australia and Canada may be in the same neighborhood, but by the time you get down to the so-called welfare state, real big welfare states, I'd even include UK there, but France and Sweden, you see that there's almost no difference between them. They pay for their welfare states how? High taxes on everybody, like the VAT taxes. So that's where it is. So compared to other countries, the top earners pay higher taxes as a share of income in the United States. Now let's talk a little bit about mobility, which is a related topic. And there are several ways that this can and has been looked at. One is, what is the share what is the percent increase that adult children have over their parents' income? So this is in real dollars, inflation adjusted. This particular study was done by the Pew Charitable Trust. Others have done similar studies. But in the bottom quintile, 93% of the children coming from that have higher income than their parents did when they become adults of about the same age. And that for the second, middle, and fourth quintiles, it's 85 to 88%, about the same. And then by the time you get to the top quintile, where their parents have set a really high bar, only 70% exceed. But nevertheless, the general trend is clearly, and this is the American dream, that the children do earn more than their parents.
There's a question, John.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is great so far, John. David Henderson here. Quick question. When you said inflation adjusted, you did talk about various ways of inflation adjusting. Which one did that use?
Good question. Unless I'm talking about it explicitly, otherwise I use whatever the source used. And in this case, in almost all cases, it's just a regular CPI.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so that's, if you would, absolute mobility. But then there's, I'll call it what we would call random mobility, or I'm sorry, relative mobility. And I'm going to build it up here, so bear with me for a minute here. This chart here shows what I've called random mobility, and it says that the relationship here is 0. So if I'm born in the bottom quintile, then I'm equally likely to grow up to have income in any one of the quintiles. So I'm equally likely to go there. And if that's the case, then that says parents have no effect on the outcome of their children in terms of IQ, in terms of behavioral patterns, in terms of support, in terms of being able to buy tutors, send them to the best schools, whatever it may be. If it looks like this, then there's just absolutely no relationship between parent and child. The other end of the spectrum is the fully determined, where I say relationship equals 100%, whereas whatever your parents have, that's what you're stuck with. And reality, of course, is somewhere in between. And so there are studies that then go and measure these differences, usually over several decades, trying to get the children at approximately the same age as the parents. Some of them do better jobs than others on that. But there were 3 pretty well-known studies, and we've averaged the 3. In the book, we actually cover all 3 of them, and we put it in between. And that looks a whole lot closer to random than it does to fully determined. Now, it's not purely random, but let's walk through it a little bit here. And here we say the relationship is 11.5%. That is to say, 11.5% of the children as adults are their positions are related to their parents more than would be expected randomly, because we would expect those numbers to all be 20 if it were random. We'd expect them all to be 100% if it were not random. And if we look here at in the middle 3 quintiles, we see that about 23, 24% of children grow up to be in the same quintile as their parents, which says, okay, so just a little bit more than. And if you're looking at the middle quintile there, 39% of them go higher than their parents, 38% go lower. So, by rounding error, they're essentially the same. So some go up, some go down. Now, it's not a perfect relationship, but the point is it's heavily determined by how hard the children work, what their particular interests are, so on and so forth, that causes them to rise and fall relative to others. In absolute terms, they almost all benefit versus their parents. In relative terms, they differ a bit because they have different environments, they have different capabilities, and so on. But what's interesting is that some people draw a weird conclusion out of this, and they call it stickiness at the extremes, or stickiness at the corners, because 38% of the bottom quintile stays in the bottom, and the same number stays at the top. But this so-called stickiness is not an economic phenomenon. It is a statistical phenomenon of a truncated distribution. if you're born in the bottom quintile, your parents work hard, but they're still in the bottom quintile, and you just are a total goof off and don't work at all, you can't fall any farther than the bottom. There's no basement to fall in. On the other hand, if you're Elon Musk, your parents were wealthy. You grow up to be at least at one point in time, the wealthiest man on earth, but there's no penthouse for you to move into. It's a truncated distribution. There's no place to go up from the top or down from the bottom. So this really demonstrates a lot of mobility. Of course, your parents have some influence on it, but it's small compared to what the individual effort seems to create. So the American dream in absolute terms, American households are far greater incomes than 50 years earlier, using a different approach than comparing the relative. We're looking here now at absolute terms. 1967 column here is the range of quintiles in income, again, in 2017 dollars using this CPI adjustment. And pardon me. On the right, we have what the distribution was in 2017. And if we draw a line across here, we see that only 6.2% of households in 2017 had income that was not equivalent to the top quintile in 1967. Stated positively, about 94% of households in 2017 were making income that would have put them in the top quintile in 1967. And this is counting transfer payments as income as well. Now remember, this is the top 20% of the population. These aren't the absolute richest people on earth, but nevertheless, it's a very different picture than what we're led to believe. And looking at the other end, if you look where the bottom quintile falls from 1967, that's only 0.8% of households in 2017 were still at incomes that would have placed them in the bottom back in 1967.
There's a question, John.
Yeah.
If this is a good time. Kwang.
I'm sorry?
Kwang has a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
hi.
Kwang.
Yeah. Thanks for. So actually, on the previous slide, it's just more like a comment and a question. I study probability, so I thought you had a very interesting observation about the stickiness. One comment I had was just to kind of drive the point home, and I wonder if it even matches the data. So let's say I start with the different quantiles for the parents, and I literally do a random walk, meaning starting from every income level, you have a half chance to go down, a half chance to go up, right? And if you look at the distribution of this random walk, you clearly see that the two boundaries have the highest math, because when you're on the two ends, you have half a chance of going the other direction, but you cannot go up or down, and you just get trapped. So like, is it correct understanding that that's basically what we're seeing here in some way?
Yeah, and you could do that, and I've done that. In fact, I did it a little more sophisticatedly in that if the higher up you are, the lower the probability is that you will rise, and the higher the probability is that you will fall.
Right. Then it's even worse.
And you get essentially the same answer.
I see. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Just
great question. That. Statistician after my own heart. Anything else? As long as we're paused. Okay.
Yeah, I do. It's not, David Henderson again, not a question, but a comment. We've had a number of speakers in this series over the last year or two say that real incomes have stagnated a lot. And I was going to volunteer to give a talk saying why that's not true. And I was going to base it partly on your book. And so I'm glad you're doing this, because it's completely false. Yeah.
And we don't actually, in this presentation, I don't actually touch directly on that point, but it's certainly implicit in what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. And in your book, you have I think it went up 80% or something.
Yeah.
Over some. Yeah. Thank you.
Carl also has a question. Carl, feel free to ask your question.
Yeah, John, if there, of course, with numbers, a lot can be done with them. If you were to confront, let's say, people within the government with your analysis, would it be sort of irrefutable, the conclusions we have, your interpretation of these various adjustments that you're making? Would they object, across the board with what you're doing, or is your data and your logic sort of tight enough that anyone looking at the facts objectively, you think, would come to the same conclusions?
Yeah. I would like to think it is, but here are two things that people might do, and one of them has in fact been done to some degree. They object to our putting in Medicare and Medicaid as transfer payments, because, and in fact, actually the objection came from the OECD. Because when we were doing some international comparisons, which I don't actually have in the slideshow, but is in the book, that triggered that, because they said, well, in Europe, everybody gets their healthcare covered, so therefore you can't do that. Well, yes, we can, because 80% of the population, well, it's now more like 70% of the population pays for its own healthcare, and the other 30% or so doesn't. And that's a transfer payment to them. And then the more general comment is that the transfer payments, and the healthcare being an example, may be an overstatement of the value to the customer. In other words, it may cost us $2,000 a year to put somebody on Medicaid, and that's a hypothetical number. That's not exactly the right one, but it's close. But it's not a $2,000 value to the person on Medicaid, because if you gave them $2,000, they wouldn't buy health insurance. They'd go out and buy whiskey or whatever. And that is, first of all, would be an indictment of the design of the delivery, if it were anything. But there are a couple other important points here. First of all, it is not zero. Okay, so and in fact, on the international comparisons, if we actually throw out only the healthcare pieces, Medicare and Medicaid, it still brings the U.S. range on the Gini indexes to the same range as the other major industrialized countries. So it doesn't really make that much difference. It moves them moves the U.S. one position on the ranking order. But the other, so in addition then to it's not zero, it doesn't make that much difference in the ranking. The other is that for Medicare and Medicaid, in fact, if anything, it probably understates the market value, because by the monopsony powers and the regulatory powers the government has, Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement rates, well, let me turn it the other way around. Private charges, both average of both insurance and self-pay, are 79, I believe, is 79% higher than the Medicare, Medicaid reimbursement rates are. So that the value that we're putting in here is less than the market value of it, if anything. And you can then sit around and have some arguments about what the number is, but it sure as heck isn't zero, and it doesn't seem to overstate the market value because of the lower reimbursement of Medicare and Medicaid. Does that make sense?
David,
okay.
There is a question.
That was
David.
Carl. I think whoever asked that question.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I'm just wondering to what degree, if this became widely distributed, people in the government would vehemently object to your overall analysis, or would they have to begrudgingly say, yeah, you have a lot of strength to this argument?
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, I did have a conversation with the guy who heads one of the divisions over in the census when I was looking specifically at the OECD comparisons, and he acknowledged that the statements were true. He said, but we're following OECD specs, which is an interesting dodge, because he wasn't doing too good a job of that. But that was his answer. He didn't have anything specific. And it's interesting that there's been, except for raising the question about whether we're overvaluing healthcare, we haven't been able to, flush out anybody to come argue with us. And I'd love to. And I'll invite you all to the debate.
Thank you, John. Good answer.
Okay, I'll take questions from Josh and Rick, who have not asked questions so far, and then I will let you finish the presentation if that's okay, John.
Yeah.
Okay, Josh first, and then Rick.
Well, while I'm speaking, I mean, terrific work, and just my commendation to you and your co-authors. I was like one of the first buyers of the book, and anyway. So going to the question, I had a couple comments, but I want to just go to the question about what government agencies are saying and doing. I think for for a while now, at least maybe a decade or two, the CBO has been, Congressional Budget Office has been producing after-tax, after-transfer figures on income inequality. And that's sort of the basis that I have been using when I'm asked about income inequality, and I say that it actually hasn't gone up that much after tax and after transfer, and people look at me as though I've just claimed that the earth is flat, or maybe rather that I've claimed the world is spherical back at a time when they thought the earth was flat. But those stats are essentially my basis for that. And if you look at those, you also can look at things like top 1% after tax, after transfer income shares, and you see that hasn't gone up very much at all. Actually, it's bumped around to like 10% and 16% over the last 3 decades or so, and now is at around 13%. So those numbers have been to me, I've relied on those. So my question to you is, how has what you have been doing, how does that relate sort of to the CBO's approach? What do you think of what the CBO is doing, and how should I think about comparing your stats to what the CBO does?
Okay, in fact, we've actually used the CBO as to fill some of the gaps in our own stuff, a lot, in fact. I regret that, unlike census, which is required to, CBO is not required to and won't share their micro data, because I think that would be very valuable. But nevertheless, what they've done is highly consistent. The differences are these. One is that they don't include state and local taxes, so which we've added to it. So that makes the tax bite bigger. There are a couple places, and I now forget which ones they are, but there are a half dozen places anyway, where they also do not include certain transfer payments. And so we've added those in. In fact, we've relied on some of their work to not have to work so hard ourselves. So they're reasonably consistent. Their numbers fall between ours and census because they account for the federal taxes, but not the state and local. They account for, instead of accounting for like 33% of the transfer payments, they account for only like, I think it's 75, 80%, because there's certain transfer payments that they don't include. And some of them are ones that they say they're working on including, but they're trying to figure things out, which I don't think is all that hard. But so they're consistent with each other. They're not exactly the same by any means. Getting back to your original question, it's interesting that we've had those much better numbers than the census numbers for a number of years, and nobody pays any attention to them.
Right. Just a quick follow-up. Can you also use your methodology to derive after-tax, after-transfer top 1% income shares as the CBO
Yeah, in fact, well, I don't know if I did it as the numbers to do that are actually in the book. If you look on, let's see if I can find the page here real quick. But in the chapter on the super rich, where's
okay, I see it. Table 7.1. I got it. Okay.
Yeah, and you could do shares from that. Well, actually, we do have shares on there. I forgot we had.
Yeah.
Great. Question, Rick, can you ask your question? Hopefully,
yeah. So I'm a cultural anthropologist, not an economist, but I've read your book. I thought it was great. It seems to me that what you've just done is shown the soft side of hard data. And the economics is talked about as the hard science and the social sciences. It looks very soft to me after listening to your critique. I mean, there's method variance that's massive, and yet the prestige of the numbers has supported fake news, basically, with regard to income inequality. So I'm wondering about the impact of what you've done on the broader profession, because it seems there ought to be enormous embarrassment about the method effects here. You get different stories depending upon how you measure. And secondly, on, let's say, the mainstream media other than the Wall Street Journal. I mean, does anyone take you seriously and start thinking about the kind of fake news that has been perpetuated? So that's one question. And the other has to do with what's not measured even by you, which is social and cultural capital. I mean, wouldn't one want to introduce the kinds of informal transfers that are not necessarily monetary, but in terms of services in particular communities? I mean, there are places where people are volunteering their labor in a school, so you don't have to pay for that. And it seems to me that's a benefit to your welfare. Is there a way yet to actually quantify what's called social and cultural capital in particular communities?
Well, that's an area that's a lot tougher to deal with because there's a lot less that's directly and objectively measurable. The thing that's easy about this one is that, with the exception of about 0.1% where we got some non-government sources, every number we used in here came from some government source that published says this is the amount of money we transfer, for example. It's just that census doesn't use it all.
Right. But, I work in India, in rural areas of India. And when I started going there, you would read reports. People make on the average $100 a year. And you read that and it sounds like, my God, what wretched place to live. But they have all sorts of informal networks in which people support each other. And if you actually thought, what would it cost to buy those? The numbers would look very different. And it seems to me all of that is missed in the way in which things are being recorded and represented.
Is it okay if we postpone the answer? We have 8 more minutes on, John. So if you can take these 8 more minutes to finish your presentation, maybe we can postpone the answer. I don't know.
Okay. Let's see here. Where were we? Oh, well, let me back up half a second. So we just finished this one because I was going back and forth. And so the question then is, how do we respond to these facts? And the first and most important is to require that the official numbers on income, poverty, and related items include all the transfer payments, include the effect of all taxes, and use inflation adjustments that are using the best price measurement techniques that we know about. And it's not like these are a mystery. They're well documented, just not used. And in fact, in the case of the one index, the index they need to use is right there, but they don't use it. And then we should conduct any ongoing debates within the bounds of the facts. Not make up numbers where we know what the real numbers are. And there are only 2 policy areas that are not directly related to let's get the numbers right, but that kind of just jumped out at us and hit us in the face. One is we need to really bring everyone into the workforce to realize their potential. If you don't work and you're a prime work age person, that means you will continue to benefit by the constantly increasing transfer payments, but you won't get to benefit more than that. And the upward mobility numbers tell us that lots of people in the bottom quintiles do far better than just sitting around picking up the transfer payments that are there. And the work requirement that the welfare reform back in the 1990s made actually showed that works. Be it that people went off of welfare, got jobs, and the fewer of them were in poverty today than were then back then. But instead of building on that, bureaucrats have systematically reduced that by changing the regulations on other benefits other than the TANF that replaced the aid to dependent children. And so that people were, again, faced with places that they could get freebies without having to work. So that work requirement needs to be there for all needs-based transfer payments. And the other is ensuring that all children have access to quality education. And that school choice, the money follows the kid, not follows the bureaucrat. And that because that, again, education is very important. And if those are 2 things that just jump out of the numbers to us. But the rest is, let's stick with the numbers. And with that, back to you.
Thank you very much, John. And we still have 2 more questions. If you want, you can take maybe some time to answer Rick's previous question. And then I think Josh has maybe the last question.
Yeah. Well, some of Rick's points are beyond my experience to be able to answer coherently, other than knowing that it is definitely tough to make those kinds of measurements. Although there are some that we can in fact measure, they're called non-attributable transfer payments. For example, a free clinic in a poor neighborhood, whereas if you're on food stamps, you can go to the free clinic. Now that doesn't show up as a transfer payment per se, because the doctor wasn't paid for your visit. The doctor was a paid, or the nurse practitioner was a paid government employee delivering the service. And I think that's kind of one of the sorts of things you're talking about. And those things we can in fact get a handle on, and we have included a few of those in our calculations where we had good data, because we had the data to do it. Now, there may be more that we couldn't get the data on, that we might be able to do in the same way, but that's a live one. In terms of the press, heck, I can't explain them. I work hard enough trying to explain labor force data.
Hey, Josh and Jonathan.
Okay, well, I've already spoken, but I'm going to still ask my questions. Well, first of all, to the what to do, I mean, the fact that the census continues to produce these basically garbage numbers that are then cited not only by the press, but in, just about every government hearing, is a huge problem. And so, all the policy things you mentioned in your last slide are good. Like the number one thing is that somebody needs to get in there and demand that the census change the way that they do these things. So that's just a comment. One other question I have for you was, if I were going to make the case for the inequality, the people would say inequality is exploding, it's a big problem. I would go, I'm going to make the case briefly. I want to know what you think. So if you go to like the CBO numbers, the thing you can't really refute based on at least the available data is that the top 0.01%, like 1 in 10,000 people, have seen a 500% accumulated growth in earnings since 1979, whereas the rest of the top 1% is a bit lower, and the rest of the top quintile and below is like below 100%. And so I think actually like the biggest important refutation there is that there are a lot of people moving in and out of that category. It's not the same people all the time. But also I think, and I'm interested what you think of this, I think we need to do a better job of conveying that this is not necessarily in and of itself bad, in the sense that it's probably a reflection of the fact that these people who have built businesses, created businesses that generate a lot of earnings for themselves and for others, are creating a lot of jobs for people, and that you wouldn't have seen the big income growth you see in the rest of the distribution without them. But I'm interested in what some of the other refutations that you might have to bring to bear would be for people who make those arguments.
Well, you hit some of the high points, and it's not necessarily bad, and it's not really all that different. If you look at properly adjusted for inflation, the Rockefellers and all the other robber barons, proportionally to the rest of the population, was every bit as different as the current folks are. Your point about moving in and out, I made that point about the top 400 on the tax piece. That's still true. If you look at the Forbes 400 list, the number of people who are on it today that were on it 20 years ago is vanishingly small. Nobody is there from 50 years ago or for any similar list, because they disappear. They go and they come, but they also create value. Like Bill Gates, no comment on many other things that he does, but he did create a lot of value with Microsoft. But he himself only has, in terms of the stock value, only owned 7% of it. The other 93% went to other people, including probably some of my retirement money. And so that they create value. It's because they create value that they get the big return. And these aren't people living off of their granddaddy's income. The amount of money that goes, it's single digit percentage anyway. The percentage of the top 1% who's had inheritances of greater than $100,000 or something like that. The typical inheritance is a few $1,000s, and even for the rich. So it's not clear what's so what. It's not bad. It's good because they keep reinvesting. if they took the money, went out and bought Ferraris and disappeared and stopped investing, they'd fall off the top 400 list.
Jonathan?
First, let me thank you again for an outstanding presentation. I'm going to take us a bit of ways off topic. So if you think this is better, I don't want to hold people in this room, but many of the stuff you spoke about, I get Josh's point that the census produces bad data, and then politicians use the bad data, and news sources use the bad data. But a lot of the stuff economists know. And so the extent, what really worries me about this is if things were working as I would imagine they worked 50 years ago, within the profession, these mistakes would have been corrected. Right, when Sayers did what he did, which is ridiculous, you can't drop half the sample and ignore taxes, somebody would have said, no, wait a minute, this is not an accurate thing. And I'm worried to the extent to which, in academics, the narrative is driving the research, right? The narrative, oh, the world's coming to an end. The narrative, oh, life is so bad. To the extent that we, even within the academics, are not subjecting this to unbiased peer review.
Yeah. Well, one thing you said there resonates a number of times as I've been going around talking with groups, especially with folks who are economists or related. They say, well, gee, we've kind of known this for years, just haven't ever laid it down and put the numbers on the paper. Of course, that's true. Well, then why didn't somebody do it?
Why? Why? What is
going good questions. I wish I knew the answer.
Well, I mean, I think I know the answer. The answer is that the peer review process is heavily influenced by the narrative.
Yeah. Well, there's some interesting research on medical research along that very line as well.
It's worrying.
We have a last question by Richardson.
Hi, thanks. Just a few things. I love the presentation. I also love the book. I have the book as well. Are you willing to share your slides, John? Many of them are in the book, but it'd be great to see the others.
Yeah. In fact, I believe Ken has my slides there, and he can share them with you.
I'll send them to everybody, or to everybody who requests them.
And also, beyond that, you may have missed it because it's just embedded in the text. But not only all the tables and charts from the book, as well as much of the new microdata that we created and mapped to the census ID codes, is on a website that you can go pull down.
Terrific.
I tell you what, I'll send it to Ken, and he can send it out to everybody.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you. So the specific questions I had, you showed one slide where you said I think 0.8% of the current population has incomes below the first quintile in 1967. Do you remember that one?
Yeah.
So doesn't that imply an even sharper drop in the poverty rate than what you showed? So that's one. Why don't I go through all three? My second question is, you were at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Is there sort of a culture gap between BLS and the Census Bureau that helps explain why the Census Bureau sort of does things in a funny way?
And it explains why I moved on to the private sector. Yeah, no, there used to be, I don't know whether it's still there or not, but there used to be some difference, yeah. Okay. But there's also just they share a government inertia. Unless it promotes the existing policy, it's hard to get things to move. But I think census suffers from it worse than BLS does. But again, not having been in either place in the last 40 years, I can't be sure. But I talk to people there, and for example, BLS knows that that's a better CPI, but except for the change in the tax brackets, it just isn't used.
My third question was whether any of the liberal media have covered your book, or interviewed the author.
There were a couple, but one of them was I thought Phil Graham was dead, and there was another one that was a review that was off on several points, but very little. But there've been a couple places, but not I will call them full professional reviews.
Yeah. Okay. So the only unanswered question was the 20% 67 versus 0.8.
Yeah. It's partly because you're taking kind of different looks at it, but it's roughly. Well, remember we said the poverty rate drops to 1.1% when you make all the corrections, and this is 0.8% are below the rate, and so they're the same order of magnitude, and you're counting different things. That's counting the last one we looked at that you were citing. We were counting households. Poverty counts people. So there's some minor differences, but they're the right order of magnitude. There have been some other interesting work done too. For example, defining poverty by consumption, looking at taking I forget 1980 I believe was the base year they used, but taking the poverty rate or the poverty threshold in 1980, then seeing how much people consume from the consumer expenditure survey based on that income, and then saying, okay, now how much income does it take today to buy that same set of goods and services based on the amount of consumption? How many people are in consumption poverty? And it gets a number very similar to ours, just using a very different approach.
Okay, thank you very much, John, for a great talk. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Our next talk will be on April 13th, and the speaker will be Sebastian Edwards. Thank you again.
Bye. Thank you all.
I'll send the slides to everybody.
Great talk. Thanks.